Good morning, John, and attendees, wherever you are in the world. So what I'd like to try to do is to give you some, as I said already, some historical trends, some cases, as well as some artifacts, some real things from the old days. And from that, we'll draw lessons. I mean, history is only interesting, to me at least, to the extent that one can draw lessons for today. And the lessons that I draw, because history is so complex and there's so much happening, and there's so many studies and so many companies doing this, that we sometimes get a proliferation of ideas and practices. We have checklists, we have 10 checklists, each checklist has 20 things on it. So my job, the way I see my role, at least as a teacher with my students, and as well as an executive teacher and consultant, is to boil things down. To boil things down to fundamentals, to essentials. And the fundamentals for me, many of you know this, I will repeat it but not make a big deal out of it, are 3 laws. And we'll talk about those 3 laws. And then in this particular webinar, I would like to introduce you to 5 steps, 5 key questions that you need to ask that are going to stretch your mind beyond the profession, as I said, that are part of implementing those 3 laws of success. And with that, I hope there'll be some tools. My tools in this case are, you might say, generic. They are at the big picture level, but obviously the kind of work that I do is to help companies apply this to their own world and to make it apply concretely to their decisions that they need to take. So during the time that has passed, and I told you about all these studies that are being done, alliances have also really kind of grown, not always grown, sometimes increased and sometimes decreased. And you see that in this chart, which is a collection basically of announcements of alliances, both contractual alliances, which the database calls strategic alliances, and joint ventures, which are equity-based alliances. And what you see there is they're growing in the 1990s. That is, of course, the innovation cycle that included computer hardware, and a lot at the beginning of the internet, but not quite the internet yet. And then you have 96 to 2001. The red part there is more or less the rise of the internet, and then the dot-com boom and bust. And of course, the ASAP folder I just showed you is at the peak of that red wave. And then we've had a period of time after the dot-com when I think we have almost taken stock a little bit about how to do this right. Because there was a proliferation, I think, of deals perhaps that were not necessarily all designed and managed properly. So that really took place during the 2000s, and then with a major break around the Great Recession, and then I think a pickup that we've seen since then. I must say that I was writing the book Remix Strategy around the time, a little bit around the time of the Great Recession, and I had to kind of step back and delay the book essentially in order to really take account of the new world, because the world, I think, changed after that. When you look at cross sectors for the popularity of alliances and joint ventures, it's quite striking. We know that information technology in various forms is a big user of alliances and partnerships, but it happens in every other big industry. And to some extent, we sometimes think of it as an information technology / pharmaceutical business issue, but it's not. It's in automotive, it's in energy. The oil companies, of course, have worked with joint ventures for ages. It's in all kinds of industrial media and other forms. So I think one of the things that I tend to do is to look across all of these sectors and argue and look for the fundamentals rather than always the specific context, which may be a little bit different from one sector to the next. But when you boil it down to essentials, you'll find that a lot of these sectors have a lot to learn from each other. And that's often something that I help people do too. This is a convoluted English phrase, but Rudyard Kipling, who was, of course, a poet of the British Empire, argued that you don't really know England if all you know is England. And I think that holds for us too. If all we know is the pharmaceutical business, then we don't really know it, because we have to compare it perhaps to technology and maybe even oil. And the vice versa, obviously, for all the other sectors. So in my work, I've tried to look at this idea of how companies remix, how companies basically take a leverage of, an idea from one or an asset from one and combine them, and sometimes with a merger, and sometimes with an alliance, and sometimes a loose alliance or a tight alliance, but in one way or the other, they get remixed. One way or the other, these assets are getting to be used together in order to create more value. And the reason I show you this is because I think we are part of this much larger picture. And when I look at the number and the type of merger deals that are going on in the industry, and you know this too, they have been on a roll and a peak, probably, I would say, and they've been changing every aspect of life. So whether it's healthcare or the way we make things, or the entertainment that we have, the media that we use, or how we use news, all of these various things are being transformed by reorganizations of business that are driven by combinations, by new combinations. Alliances and joint ventures are a very important part of that, and I'll show you why they fit in this spectrum. But again, with the wide-angle lens, it's important to understand the full spectrum. So when I boil all of this down, I come up with a prism. This is my way of looking at the world. And basically, any deal that you have can be looked in this prism and can split into these three corners. This is what I call the three laws of business combination, and many of you have heard me talk about this. If you haven't, there are things on the web. The book is basically, Remix Strategy is organized around these three themes. The first one is that you have to have really joint value in order to create anything new by working together. Secondly, you have to govern it properly, design it properly, so that in fact you can create that joint value. And thirdly, once you've made this new pie, you have to split the pie. And it doesn't always work in that sequence. But having a return on your investment comes from sharing the value created. So I want to talk a little bit about each one of these as we go along, but not dwell on the three laws themselves, because you can find information on that in other talks I've given. Instead, I'm going to go around that pyramid, that prism, with 5 steps. And the 5 steps, in a way, are more applicable to your daily life. How do you choose goals? How do you find a partner match? What's the deal structure that you need to have? How do you manage the relationship? And what are the results? What's the return on investment? So in a way, these 5 steps are the key 5 questions. They relate to the fundamental laws, and I'll show you how we use that. But basically, for each one of these steps, there are a number of generic tools, again, that I mentioned. Again, these are in the book. But I won't stop at the tools. I want to give you more a way to think about it. And the way to think about it is to ask at least 5 questions. And again, these are fundamentals. So strategic value, when are the partnerships really helpful in strategy? You have to know this, and you have to do it in the right time. Partner fit, what makes a good partner? This has been a topic that I think goes back to the very early days of ASAP. We've always thought about this, but there's some new lessons perhaps we have. Deal structure, what's the best way to organize it? Is it an alliance, a JV? Maybe it should be a merger. Alliance management, in terms of the actual profession that we're in, what is the way to manage a relationship so that it can become effective? And finally, from that, how do you earn and why? How come you can get an earning, and is that earning enough for the investment that you put in? So I see these 5 questions as being, in a way, ways to implement the 3 laws. And so the first one, let's just take a look at very quickly at each one of these questions. Historically, there have been alliances like this one that sounded really big and good. This was Daimler with Mitsubishi in 1990. As some of you know, there was another alliance later on. But this particular one is noteworthy because even in the press release, they say, we are great companies, great Japanese company, great European, German company. We're going to work together, but we don't know what we're going to do. And in fact, there were no projects. There was no actual meat, in a way, to this idea. And so this died. This kind of fizzled after a while. Later on in the dot-com era, we came to call those Barney alliances. And many of you know this term, right? Barney is, I love you, you love me, let's have a big hug, and that's about it. And in fact, a lot of those dot-com era alliances were party alliances. So I think it's really imperative that we understand very clearly how to create value. And in order to create value, we have to start with something Edith Penrose, one of my heroes from the old days, has introduced into the business world of theory, I guess, is to disaggregate your company into the capabilities and resources that it is. Because every company is a bundle of capabilities. And once you understand these capabilities, then you also know what capabilities you need from others. So these are not just hard assets or specific technologies, but they are also know-how, brand, organization, maybe some particular market positions that you have that are valuable. So know what those are, and then know what the partners are, because in the end, what you're trying to do is to create value by combining these complementary bundles of assets. So this is out of, again, management theory. We talk a lot about the resource-based view of the firm, and that's what this is from. And I found that it is helpful for companies to think about their combinations and their resources in this way. And then once you think about, in a way, which are the resources that might fit together, it pays, again, under question one, what's the strategy, right? It pays to think very, very hard about how actually joint value is created. What is it that will make us more powerful now that we're together? Is it a benefit of scale? Is it a scope benefit where we happen to have many different products that fit together in some way? Or is it coordination of a supply chain, which we see all the time now? So all the vertical mergers, AT&T, Time Warner, CVS, Aetna, very important to look at these mergers because that is an extreme case of a partnership. And so if the logic of creating joint value happens there, there could be that same logic that happens for an alliance. You could have an alliance between CVS and Aetna instead of a merger, and perhaps achieve the same things and maybe even at a cheaper cost. Now, the last thing that I note here are expanded options. This is from the field of real options, where we realize that strategy is the continual laying of bets. And when you lay a bet, you're buying a lottery ticket. You're buying an option on possibly success in the future. So whatever it is, think very hard about these things, because if you don't have that first question straight, then I think the next step doesn't work, right? So once we understand the first step, then the second step is, well, how do we find a good partner? Or rather, what would be a good partner? What are the criteria for having a good partner? And here, another piece from old history, again, I told you we tried to get some lessons from history, is when Apple and IBM got together. I remember this clearly, waking up and seeing this piece of news in 1991 and saying to myself, whoa, this is not going to work. And 4 years later, it didn't work. And this particular alliance was fraught, I think, from the beginning with danger due to basically the intense rivalry between these firms. There are other reasons, and one can talk about culture and things like that, but I really think that in the end, they didn't make it work because they didn't want to make it work. And in this case, it's very clear. Now, today, the same companies, IBM and Apple, are in a different boat. Both of them are in different boats. The Apple boat is floating very high. The IBM boat is always trying to improve itself, and it does. And so they have formed a partnership which is successful in today's age. It works, but in those days, it didn't work. And so it's very important, I think, to understand what makes for a good partner fit. And as I just indicated, I think it's also clear that this can change over time, and that even a good fit today may not be a good fit tomorrow. Look, for example, at HP and Oracle. They were a great partner until they weren't. So the important thing in figuring out partner fit is, first of all, this top line of what I'm going to show you is a table, which is how do you compare various partners. And I am struck, I've had a number of clients where basically they want to approach a particular partnership. And my first question always is, so what are your alternatives? You thought about doing it yourself, or have you looked at other partners, and how does this partner compare, and what do they bring that the others don't bring? Those questions sometimes didn't get asked. And that to me is actually almost a sign of danger. So you have to ask the questions. Whether or not you actually get bids and negotiate with multiple partners, that's up to you how you can manage that negotiation skill. But at least understand in your mind what your alternatives are. And here I would go back basically to the criteria that are in a way generated by the three laws, which is first, can you create joint value? What is the real meat that's going to create a better version of both of us? And then very importantly, how can we work together? And finally, can we split the value? Do we agree on how we do that? And for each of these, there are a number of questions. And this is what I mean by generic strategy, in that each one of these questions has to be tailored to your own business. If you're an automobile company forming a deal with a ride-sharing company, GM, with Lyft or something like that, it's going to be a different set of questions than if you're Pfizer or Bayer and you're making a deal with a biotechnology company, or you're a cybersecurity software services company that's creating a whole alliance constellation of partnerships in order to compete. So all of those are ways to find partners, fit partners. And in the fitting of partners, at least I found that complementary capabilities and then complementary attitudes, and especially limiting conflicting interests. I think that's often underestimated. And we talk about words like co-opetition as if it's an easy thing, and it's not. And so one has to manage the competition, I think, quite carefully. And finally, how do you balance the returns? Do we think we're going to get enough out of it to make it worthwhile for ourselves, and vice versa for your partner? So step 3, now you have a partner, you have a strategy. So what's the deal structure? Now, this is a huge area, and I'm only going to touch on it here because, in fact, a lot of that research work that I told you has been done over the years has been actually about this particular word. Let me go back to something Scott McNealy said, and he was, of course, the CEO of Sun Microsystems during the heyday of the Sun Microsystems during the 1990s and early 2000s. This is what he said: most overused phrase in business, strategic partnership or partner. My favorite partnership is a purchase order. Defined charter, beginning and end. Now, he said this in 2011 on Twitter, which is why I have it. But I heard him, or at least heard of him saying it when I worked with Sun right around the year 1999. So this is something that those people who know Scott will know. This has always been in his blood. And a tremendous manager and leader, and he's done tremendously good things, except in this case, I think he's got the definition of partnership a little bit off. So let me show you why. A partnership really is part of a spectrum. And the spectrum runs from short to long time, and from very deep joint decision-making to very arm's length decision-making between the parties. And you can put your different terms on here, and different people will have different ways of thinking about it. But there is a spectrum, and I think we all think about a spectrum. And when we think about that spectrum, there are very clearly two ends of this. The top right-hand end is full integration. You can call it the M&A arm. The bottom left is actually what Scott McNealy was talking about, because he loves those purchase orders. He loves those competitive deals where there's a purchase, there's a exit, and there's not an entangling relationship in a way. And everything in the middle, the orange box, are those entangling relationships. So everything we call alliances, whether it's a joint venture or a joint R&D or anything in between, those are forms of decision-making and collaboration that are short of full merger and deeper than that arm's length purchase order. And when we look at it theoretically, now the faces you see there are all Nobel Prize winners in economics for the theory of transactions cost, and the theory of organizational design, and the theory of contracts. And in the theory of contracts, it's very common to make the following distinction. What we have on the left-hand side, which is what Scott McNealy was talking about, are complete contracts. A purchase order is very complete. Everything is in there. We know what we have to pay and deliver. And frankly, if we don't, we know what court we're going to end up in. When you see the top right, there's another form of also very good, clear control, which comes from basically fully controlling all the assets. What you have in the middle are essentially incomplete contracts, and this is the term that's used in the economics of law. incomplete contracts, and there is shared control over decision making. And so everything we do in deal making has to do partly with positioning the deal somewhere along the spectrum. And in my book, I have some more criteria for that. How do you distinguish a partnership from a vendor, which is more or less at the bottom left there, right? And how do you distinguish a merger from a joint venture? Again, that's on the top right. What's important, I think, to realize in any one of these cases is that goes to the soul of what you do, what your partnerships are about. And the soul of that is that every partnership, every alliance is an incomplete contract. It's an open-ended contract, a contract where you cannot state in it everything that will happen in the future. You know this because you're working on new things, you're doing innovation. So you're working on things that haven't panned out yet. And when they pan out, you will come up with questions that you didn't even think about earlier. And now you have to work out those questions with your partner. And that's where the shared decision-making comes in. So whether it's unexpected positive news that we get, or it's unexpected negative news, it's a competitor that comes up with something new, that makes our contract suddenly become something we need to talk about again. And the decisions we need to take, in a way, are driven by the constantly being buffeted, being hit by unexpected things. And that leads us to new decisions, and new decisions, and new decisions, and new decisions. And if you're in the alliance world and you live in alliance management, this is where you live, down there under alliance governance. And that's why we set up governance structures. That's why we set up steering committees. That's why we set up boards of directors when we have joint ventures that have formal boards of directors. So all of these different ways of managing the incompleteness is really nature of the deal. And the reason why this is important for deal making, not just for managing the alliance, is that the deal makers, the business development, the investment bankers, the contract negotiators, the lawyers, the business development professionals, they need to basically design the alliance so that it can live through the following years where we know it's going to be constantly renewed and constantly revised. And if it's too harsh and too rigid and strict in the way it's set up, then it's probably going to crack. And this I know also from studying some very, very, very old alliances from the earliest days, like Xerox and Fuji Photofilm. That's an interesting story at this very moment. But in its long 50, 60-year history, you see continual renewal of the nature of the deal. The deal is never done. And I think that's one of the rules we've learned over time from history. So if the deal isn't done, you have to manage it. And that's where alliance management comes in. And I think for the most part, ASAP and many in our audience have focused in this particular niche of this 5-step process I'm describing. So I told you it's a wide-angle lens. And because of that, we have tremendously useful and new ideas and practices, much more deeper and better than 30 years ago. And I kind of went back to see what did we know then and what do we know now in terms of really defined alliance management. And I must end up, first of all, with a little bit of history here from computers. You see Bill Gates and Andy Grove here. And we know that Wintel is probably the most successful partnership in the world, the most profitable. But if you go back to the very early days of the relationship between Microsoft and Intel, this is what happened. In one of their first meetings, Gates went to Grove's house for dinner to discuss how to resolve an impasse they had. The dinner conversation quickly turned to be so explosive that even the caterers came in to ensure that all parties were safe. According to Grove, I'm the only one who finished my salmon, and Gates never even touched his plate. That's interesting. What's more interesting, after this event, the two did not speak for several years. And it wasn't until Windows 3.0 was introduced in 1990 that a rapprochement began. This is in the Harvard Business School case by David Yoffie. He should know, he's on the board of Intel. But basically, I think these relationships don't always get managed well. Intel and Microsoft lost a lot of possible value when they didn't manage it well. And I think over time they learned to do that. Now, going back to what we've learned at ASAP. And here I go to the very first binder that I showed you. And just before my talk, was a talk by Nelson Sims. Nelson Sims, I think, is the grandfather of everything we're doing now in terms of alliance management, because basically he set up the Eli Lilly Office of Alliance Management. He was brought in when Lilly realized how important alliances are to their future, and he was brought. He was a very senior guy. He ran Lilly in Canada, and so when he was brought in, he basically got the right tools in place, the people in place, the authority, the responsibility for what we today call the Office of Alliance Management at Eli Lilly, to which I think many other pharmaceutical companies, in a way, are finding their own ways to do something that I think Lilly probably brought to the world. And our friends David Thompson and Mike Ransom got a beautiful piece in Wall Street Journal, and I wondered how they got that. But it is about exactly their relationship at the time with Amylin, and how the role of alliance management was important in keeping that thing on track or keeping it from collapsing. And so this is the Wall Street Journal, I think, recognizing the value of alliance management. And again, I think Eli Lilly was at the beginning of that. And since then, we've developed a lot more deeper, more concrete, more refined, more applied to different businesses, both in the pharmaceutical industry as well, of course, in other industries. But this is, I think, the start of the pharma part. So when I try to boil things down, which I tend to do, I come up with basically 7 kind of things you need to do well, both in the alliance design as well as in the alliance management. And I realize it's easy to say manage both the part of the business and the relationship. There's a lot more in there. And for every one of these, I think, again, there have been excellent tools and practices developed over the years that you can get access to by basically talking to people in your industry. Because this is probably something that we have probably cracked. I think we have cracked this case. I think we found how to manage these things properly. What we haven't cracked fully is the strategic context in which they're based. That's why I'm giving you this wider lens. But let's take a little bit more, a final look at what's important that I think we have not cracked. We have not fully understood return on investment. And we have not fully understood, in the end, who earns what and why. This is the kind of question theorists ask, where does value get distributed? What is the formula for sharing value? This is often something when I talk about this at an ASAP conference, sometimes people say, no, that's not our job. Our job is to keep the alliance happy. That is true. But in the end, your job is justified because you are bringing value to the company. And so it's important to understand how value gets appropriated or captured by the company. People like Bill Gates and Andy Grove were very, very sharp about this. I talk about this in my book. This is probably the hardest part of my book to write because it's hard to get, in a way, honest opinions from managers about how they're managing this. But it is possible to step back and draw some conclusions. So the conclusions I draw, first of all, is that this is really tricky, as I said. And partly it's tricky because the ownership sharing mechanism, the way value gets divided once it gets created by putting together the right complementarities and then managing it right, the way it gets divided is through multiple transaction terms, you might call it that. So if it's some sort of equity, then there's ownership shares. There may be fees and royalties, of course, in many cases. There may be transfer prices. That's a very important one. If your business tends to buy or sell from the alliance or with the alliance or supply the alliance, those in the oil industry, resource-based industry, industrial sector companies, they know this very well. And transfer prices and the conditions in which that takes place is an important variable. There's learning. I worked with one company that said, our alliance with that new biotech company is going so well. We got so much. It's so happy. But you know what? Our engineers, our scientists aren't able to absorb what we learned. In a way, right? So there's always a sort of not invented here problem, and that's a loss, right? Because here you are, you've created a good deal, and you've kind of worked it to create value, and somehow it's not being transferred to the places where it matters. And finally, competitive markets. Even Intel and Microsoft, even though they were partners, they continue to compete in certain ways. And over time, what matters is not just that you split the value in a certain way. This particular chart I learned from Tom McAvoy, who used to be top in Corning Glass. He is another giant in the field of practice at the time. He understood joint ventures very well. And Tom told me, look, you can start with a certain split, and maybe partner A is getting less than partner B. If they agree to that up front, that's fine. It doesn't have to be 50-50. It could be 80-20. But over time, the actual returns might be a little different. So if they're sort of like up and down along the edge of what you expected, then that's fine. We kind of forbear from year to year. This year is my year. Next year, you're getting a little bit more, that kind of thing. But over time, if there is a shift over time that one company is really getting a lot more than the other, then you can bet that this alliance is going to come under serious friction, if not break. And so the job of alliance management here, in part, is to realize this and sometimes adjust to make it happen. This is the kind of thing that happened with Microsoft and Intel very clearly, and that's more of that is in my book. But you realize where this is going, right? So in the end, when you boil all this down, and again, I told you I like to boil things down. So when you boil all it down, what is it that gives you the power to capture more value? And over time, maybe more power to capture more value. Like Pixar captured more value from Disney over time compared to when they started. They started at 80-20, then they went to 50-50, and eventually Pixar was fully acquired by Disney. So this happens over time, the change in the balance of power and earnings. And here I would go to this man. This is before my time and before your time. Those of you in the baseball world will recognize this as being Babe Ruth. And this is now blasphemous maybe for me to use him as an example as a Red Sox, because he was famously sold to the New York Yankees for a record amount. And after that, the Red Sox never won until they won again. And since then, we've beaten the Yankees really good. So what is important here is to understand that the value of Babe Ruth or any player or any sports player or other comes from what they contribute. He's the most valuable player. So if you're a most valuable player, you're going to command high salaries. And everybody's happy with that because you help us all win. Now, of course, today we have answers to Babe Ruth. This is Mookie Betts. He is our current hero and the current most valuable player, again, of the American League. And he is due to be a free agent next year, and God only knows what kind of salaries he will command. But it will be because of what he brings to the table. And so the bottom line for alliances here is that really you can capture value from them, but that value will be proportional to what you contribute. And if you don't contribute much of value, then you're not going to have the bargaining power in the world to capture more value. If you do contribute the key pieces like Intel did and Microsoft did and IBM didn't, then you can capture value. And maybe more poetically, the Beatles said, in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. So that's boiling it down really, 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 really well for you completely to one point there. But let's just step back. The 5 questions really are about goals. Always keep in mind how to create value. What is value that's going to be created by this thing? It's about partner match. How do we complement each other and not compete? And I do think that competition is a red herring you have to be careful about. And what kind of deal do we need? Think about how to govern incompleteness. That really is the core of it. Because if you could tell everything clearly like Scott McNeely wanted, then write a contract, don't do an alliance. Or if you think full control is the only way to manage this complexity, then do that, don't do an alliance. When you do an alliance, it's because you don't want to do the full control, and you cannot write a clear contract that covers all the bases. And therefore, you need to go with the flow. And therefore, the deal structure has to be how to manage this incompleteness in our contract. How do you manage a relationship? Really, again, as I think you have all of this in most of what you do in ASAP. And I think the bottom line for me is that you have to manage change. That this is a constant process of change, and managing is what's key. And the results, well, be the most valuable player. If you can be the most valuable player in your alliance or your combination of any sort, you'll do well. So thank you very much for your attention. I recommend that you dig a little deeper. My website has materials on this, the book has materials, and the LinkedIn Learning course basically goes through the 5 steps quite a bit more.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I think we're out of time for questions. That's a good wrap to a really forthright and thoughtful big picture presentation today. Thank you so much for your time. We've been today with Ben Gomes-Casseres, author of Remix Strategy, Brandeis University professor, bringing us 30 years of perspective on alliance management in the greater context of business combinations. Thanks. Hope you'll join us for the next ASAP Netcast webinar, and you'll see an archive of this webinar available within the next few days.
Thank you, John, and thank you for all of your attendance and listening.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.